Good afternoon. Welcome to this federal interview. We are meeting at a very critical time when the US president has already brought tariffs into effect on 7th August. Then there are some other tariffs which are still hanging fire. For example, 25% extra tariff on India because it buys oil from Russia will come into effect on 27th of August. There is a complete turmoil in the global trading system. Countries are unable to, assess the kind of repercussions immediately they will be hit. To discuss several issues, particularly the impact of tariffs on countries like India and other developing countries, we have with us Richard Kozul-Wright. Mr. Richard Kozul-Wright was the director of Globalisation division of the UNCTAD till last year. During his period, the UNCTAD has, brought developing countries together to fight the kind of protectionist tendencies of the industrialized, developed countries. And their division was singularly responsible for bringing out several programs on which the South-South trade can be advanced, and how to overcome the kind of challenges that they are currently facing in the multilateral trading system. Richard Kozul-Wright right now teaches in SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies of London University. He as well as in Boston University. Welcome, Richard. I would like to first ask you to characterize what is this current situation we are facing, particularly a country like India, which is soon going to have 50% tariff. Already it is hit with a 25% tariff on a range of goods. So several developing countries are also facing this current challenge. So I would, you could tell the audience and the viewers about what you would see as this current, challenge in the global trading system.
Ravi, thanks. Nice to see you again. Look, it's a difficult moment, obviously, because the kind of normal way of doing things has been upturned by what amounts to a rogue hegemon. It's still hegemonic, the US, and I think there's a lot of talk about being in a post-hegemonic era, but that's clearly not the case. The fact that most countries have spent the last 3 or 4 months trying to placate Trump tells you just how addicted they've been to a world in which US markets have been relatively open. And Trump closing those markets is now obviously going to cause a lot of disruption for developing countries. Perhaps not as much as people think. Economists are also addicted to free trade. It's part of our DNA. We were brought up to believe that comparative advantage and the Ricardian model was the kind of defining aspect of how the economies work both nationally and globally. And we tend to overestimate both the opportunities that come with trade and the damage that comes from protectionist measures. I mean, damage is hard written into that economic model. So, trying to assess where this will go is not easy. But for most countries who have become used to this way of doing things, it's going to cause a huge amount of difficulty. And part of that, of course, comes not from the tariffs themselves, but from the uncertainty of the administration's whimsical approach to protectionism. It's not the kind of protectionism that we've seen in the past. Protectionism has been inherent in the trading system since it was established at the end of the Second World War. There's nothing unusual about that or necessarily damaging. I mean, developing countries have long argued for protection as part of their development strategies. So that's not, I think, the real source of the trouble. The trouble is it's just incredibly unpredictable. He bases decisions not on a kind of economic rationale that most people don't understand, and a political rationale that is driven by personal and oddly political calculations.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard. The justification that has been provided by the Trump administration, including the U.S. Trade Representative, is that it has long been taken for a ride and cheated, and its great market was used as an opportunity by countries across the board to make up huge surpluses in their trade, while they blocked or they protected their markets, not ensuring that the American goods are not sold. I mean, this is the justification the Trump's chief U.S. trade representative, Jamieson Greer, gave in a long article yesterday in the New York Times. How justified is this approach?
It's not a justified argument. I mean, tariffs have come down tremendously, particularly in the developing world, over the course of the last 40 years, under pressure both at the WTO and, of course, under pressure bilaterally and through the Washington-based institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. So developing countries are now more open today than they've ever been historically.
Yes.
And of course, so that's that kind of historical argument just doesn't hold water. And of course, when they come to saying we've been cheated, the question is, who is we? Certainly not American corporations. American corporations have done extremely well out of the system that they themselves were responsible for designing to a large extent. So, you look at the world, and people forget, we tend to live in a world where we think countries trade with each other. Countries don't trade with each other. Firms and mainly very large firms trade with each other and with markets abroad. It's companies that do the trading. And American companies, American TNCs, are still the most profitable in the world and have done extremely well out of this system. The problem of course they have. I mean, the problem is that in the old days, when GM was at the center of the American economy, what was good for GM tended to trickle down to the rest of the economy. In a world in which Google and Amazon are the center of the American economy, the benefits to the corporation do not trickle down very far to the rest of the economy. But that's nothing to do with being cheated or ripped off, or the language that is used by the current administration in Washington. That's the dynamics behind that are very different.
Right. Most of these, deals that have been reached, not with all 60 countries, some of the countries, they're not written in, stone. They're not also legally binding. There is a panic among the developing countries, particularly including India. India has been hit with the 25% on grounds that it is not ready to open up its agricultural market. I mean, agriculture for American exports in agriculture, which is a big item. So India has a huge population of 1.4 billion people, out of which 800 million depend on agriculture. So do you think that this is a kind of approach India ought to have followed from the day one, when they started embracing the Trump administration, that they are ready for a major deal, major agreement with the US in the next 6 months? And today they realize that they are in a hot spot. So how would what would be your response to this kind of bullying approach of the Trump administration?
Well, I mean, I do think, for a while the Indian administration thought they could have their cake and eat it too.
Yeah.
I mean, but I've heard recently officials be very clear about, exposing the double standard. Of course, now that the U.S. that imports all kinds of things still, either directly or indirectly from Russia, and then being accused of doing the same and having tariffs imposed on it. So I think, the Indian officials have been very clear now about exposing that double standard. I think they hoped for a while that they could get away with ignoring it. And that was, given the nature of the administration, that was not a very sensible strategy to take.
Yeah.
From our point of view, India needs to, in a similar way to China, it's going to have to get more serious about South-South cooperation generally, and which is weird because India historically has been a leader in the narrative around South-South cooperation, and I think it needs to get back to that agenda.
Richard, I'll get back to the South-South cooperation, but on agriculture, for example, I think what India has done seems to be a very right thing, given the kind of challenges it has in its own agriculture system, where 800 million people depend on agriculture with small farms. They can't let heavily subsidized American farm products to sort of, price open the Indian market. What would you think about it?
No, I agree. That again, it's part of the hypocrisy. You know better than anyone, Ravi. Agriculture has always, for the countries preaching free trade in the advanced world, as they hugely subsidize, and that's not just the American. Obviously, that's true of Japan. It's true of the European Union. It's true of Switzerland. Agriculture, in that sense, was kind of symbolic of the hypocrisy at the heart of the post-WTO trading system. Which is why it's always been this major sticking point in negotiations in Geneva, of course. In this, Trump, in that sense, is Trump is not the end of neoliberalism in any sense, but it's the end of the fiction of a rules-based international order, right? That's what Trump is doing. He's exposing that. We've argued that was never an adequate description of the way in which the post-war and certainly the post 1980, post 1995 international trading system worked. The advanced economies always were rigging the rules in their favor as they preached "do as I say, not as I do" to the bulk of the developing world. And we've been here before. Nixon. This idea that Trump is sui generis, that it's come out of nowhere, is not a very accurate
new approach. Yeah.
Yes, it's not an accurate account of Americans' role as the hegemon. They did it in 1971 with Nixon when it cut the gold link with the dollar. It did it again at the end of the 1970s with the Volcker shock, which was in many respects more important to the future direction of the world economy than Nixon. These are all unilateral decisions that the US has taken to make sure that the system worked in its favor.
Richard, we are facing a challenge that also offers some opportunities, particularly for the developing countries, which are severely hit. Whatever it is, they have been using this current international trading system that has now been upended by one President Donald Trump. And every country is at a great disadvantage. So what should the developing countries per se, do? For example, yesterday, Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke to the Brazilian President Lula da Silva. And there seems to be a growing communication between these developing countries. So what, in your view, would constitute a some plan, a constructive, cooperative plan, which can rally around developing countries of a global south?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we do see it as an opportunity, Ravi. And that's where there is these parallels now with the 1970s, right? Because the disruption that Nixon caused in 71, of course, triggered a collective effort by the South to rethink the rules of the international game. I mean, that was the origins of the new international economic order discussion back in the 1970s. I don't think it's a very different moment for all kinds of reasons, both the way in which the advanced economies operate and the way in which developing countries behave. I don't think we're in a new international economic order moment. Unfortunately, I'd like to think we were, but we're not. But I do think there are still opportunities that, there's a new narrative to be had. And I would argue probably a twofold narrative. I mean, you're right. I mean, one of those narratives has to be South-South cooperation. There's no doubt about that. South-South trade accounts now for something like 45% of world trade. China, as the manufacturing factory for the world, offers a unique opportunity for other developing countries to become part of that story. India's role in that is more complicated, always has been, but there are real opportunities that need to be explored. And unlike, I think, the 1970s, the South has already created a kind of skeletal South-South infrastructure. We have institutions like the new development bank, the contingency reserve arrangement, all kinds of new regional models that have emerged over the last 10, 15 years that weren't there at the time of the new international economic order. So I think developing that and coming up with a proper set of South-South rules, South-South cooperation, it's always been a rhetorical level. The G77 has used it rhetorically, but we do need to rethink a set of principles and rules for real South-South cooperation and integration. That's a task for the developing world, I think, now. I think the other part of that story, though, is that too much of the developing world has become addicted, or that would be wrong. There's too much of a sense that the external environment will solve their development problem, and that's no longer the case vis-a-vis the North-South relationships. We see that everywhere. It's not true in climate. It's not true in development. It's not true in the health sphere. So there's got to be a much stronger focus on domestic resource mobilization in the South, right, and rethinking the institutions and particularly the institutions of the state that are required to ensure that countries can mobilize sufficient domestic resources that even if they don't get support from the external environment, can begin to drive a more meaningful and sustainable growth process. So it's a kind of double kind of process of South-South cooperation, domestic
two-pronged approach.
Two-pronged approach.
Richard, one of the tragedies, along with most of the international organization being upended, particularly the WTO, has completely lost its, it's unable to stand up. And the Director General and all are looking for their own, continuation in that job. The organization you had worked, that is UNCTAD, used to be a solid, what you would call provided some kind of an intellectual basis as well as technical cooperation on several things. Even UNCTAD is dead under the current Secretary General. In the absence of an organization like UNCTAD, which stood for developing countries, it used to be called as the Trade Union of Developing Countries. What could happen? I mean, what do you need in terms of creating a new organization or something that can bring around, coalesce all the developing countries on a global South-South narrative?
Yeah, UNCTAD's demise, sadly, has been a long time in the making, Ravi. Developing countries have, the G77 de facto abandoned UNCTAD before the global financial crisis. It's a real tragedy, the way in which UNCTAD has evolved over the last 15, 20 years, really. Recupero, in that sense, was probably the last real Secretary General from the South. I mean, Superchai tried, I think, but times had changed. Even during,
yeah.
yeah, and you know, and he, but it, you know, so that notion of a kind of collective, a large collective voice for the South doesn't seem to be credible at the moment. I think what needs to happen, I do think the BRICS, they'll have to create their own secretariat. Especially as they're getting larger, they're now, there's now, I don't know what the formal membership is. 11 or 12 countries are now formally members of the BRICS, and there's a large number of countries that are kind of have this kind of secondary status. They haven't formally joined, but they've aligned themselves with the BRICS.
Yeah.
So, when that happens, I think it's imperative that you create. They'll have to create an independent, and this is the tricky part. It's what UNCTAD had, and the developing countries, I think, have lost. You have to create an institution that is committed to the project, but has enough independence to be able to forge positions that are not simply dictated to by the most powerful members. That's the struggle. And that's I think that has to happen, and at the same time, and it's a very important part of that South-South story is the development of regional arrangements, which we're seeing, like the Continental Free Trade Area in Africa, and or the strengthening of ASEAN. I mean, things we're beginning to see, and so I think that kind of institutionalization of a voice for the South or subparts of the South has to be the project going forward. And the belief that somehow the South can align itself now with the Europeans because the Europeans are upset with Trump is pipe dreams, in my opinion. The Europeans will never abandon the transatlantic alliance. In many respects, they're more reactionary than Trump on economic issues. And so the South that's a fantasy that this developing countries should not indulge in. They need to take seriously the South-South agenda.
Right. In fact, that leads me to the other question. This year, India is going to hold the presidency for the BRICS. And it's a very important moment given the kind of where India is placed at this point of time. All that it put all its eggs in one basket of the United States, and suddenly it's realizing that it has gone completely haywire. So what would you suggest for a country like India, which is going to host the BRICS presidency this year, to sort of pursue in terms of an agenda?
Well, I think it's the kind of agenda we've been talking about. When India took over the G20, that was what, 3-4 years ago.
3 years ago, yeah.
There was a lot of expectation. It was Indonesia, then India, then South Africa, then Brazil, and there was this hope that somehow out of that leadership by the South, the G20 would somehow change the way in which it operates and the ideology on which it's based. And it hadn't happened. India was far too indulgent of that process, in my opinion, to actually come up with serious and meaningful kind of solutions to the current problems that developing countries and indeed the global economy more generally face. So that's not a route to follow. It's got to get back to its own roots. India had an incredibly pivotal role in the creation of a solidaristic voice for the South in the 60s and the 70s. And, obviously it's not simply repeating that kind of agenda because the world has changed in many respects. But going back to that approach has to be at the center of any sort of leadership agenda that India assumes, I think.
Richard, actually, there has been, a lot of interesting moves made on the so-called cross-country border trade between the southern countries, the BRICS countries, and how they could be sort of addressed, in terms of currency issues and local currencies. Where is that idea now? How should it be pursued further?
Well, I mean, that's a sad story, because that was the Russians who were the presidents of the
Initiated this idea.
Brazil. They not only an idea, but they came up with a potential structure for some sort of common payments union, and it was
Right.
India that was not willing to
To
kind of
back it
pursue
up.
it. So, and I think that was a mistake. I think that's a real opportunity, and it's not
Right.
about an alternative to the dollar. That's
Right.
again, that's
It
too
is not.
simplistic.
Correct.
No, but it's a very useful way of managing certain types of international trade relationships, and with positive benefits all around. And I think, I mean, obviously different countries have different interests and different concerns, and there's always a concern about China, because clearly China is the dominant player within the BRICS right now in almost every respect, and that raises some concerns, of course. But there's I think India needs to kind of get into that discussion rather than dismiss that, to really think through how you can advance that kind of initiative within the context of the BRICS arrangements as a positive step forward.
Yeah, I think that's a major challenge for this meeting, which is going to be under Indian presidency. I mean, how serious it is to pursue alternative, payment methods, and moving away from, the dollar monopolized system. Uh, so the other question, Richard, where I mean, in terms of political economic, where is the question about globalization? There has been a retreat from globalization, and but still neoliberal economic policies and trade policies still continue to haunt many of the developing countries. What is the way out of addressing the current challenges? I mean, something in terms of a kind of a break, a rupture. Uh, where would one has to start with this right now? Where is the globalization gone, or is it still there? And
The world has been globalizing in different ways, Ravi, for centuries, right?
correct.
And so, I mean, it's in some respects it's not a very helpful term, globalization. The nature of economic interdependence, which was the term that UNCTAD always used to describe the interaction of the North. We live in an interdependent, asymmetric world. I mean, and we still live in an interdependent, asymmetric world. So that I don't find the talk about deglobalization versus that's not a discussion that I find very helpful. For me, the problem, I mean, the biggest the big winner from the world as it was structured post 1980 or the mid 1980s was that it was a world that was created by and for the benefit of large capital. I mean, the big winners from this world have been big international firms, particularly in the North, but also including some from the South, of course. And a lot of the problems that we talk about, the inequalities, the problems of indebtedness, the problems of insufficient productive investment, so a lot of these problems can, in some significant way, be traced back to a world that is dominated by these powerful players. They have not only economic influence, because they have incredible political influence too, with governments in the North and the South. And until we rein in the power of big capital to move where it wants, when it wants, and how it wants, I think it's very difficult to come up with a progressive agenda for the North and the South. And so we're going to have to rethink the role of capital controls and how we can use those in a constructive way to rein in that undue power. And there are efforts in that, we see the efforts with respect to taxation at the UN and the problems of illicit financial flows that have become significant. So there are movements in that direction, but that we don't have a real political agenda that is talking again about capital controls and their importance. So I think we need to get back into that agenda, and we need to talk again about planning, Ravi.
Right.
Fortunately, we can, UNCTAD, as you know, was an institution that never gave up on industrial policy as an essential part of the development policy toolkit. And in a funny way, we won that battle eventually, right? Because everyone's now talking about doing industrial policy, from Biden to Macron to, the people, and then but planning, I think, needs to, the notion of strategic planning and what we mean by that and how we bring together different voices that are required to make it. That's a real serious agenda that needs to be elaborated again, particularly in the South, I think.
Yeah, Richard, one last question, namely, this is again Trump-Putin meeting on 15th of August in Alaska. India has been subjected to a 25% tariff because of the oil it has been buying, and Trump has accused India of, in very damaging terms, disparaging terms. Suppose if there is a deal between US and Russia on 15th of August, can he have any rationale to continue with tariffs on India? 25% tariff.
It's difficult to see that, but that administration is not necessarily driven by rational thought or calculation, Ravi. But it's important that we get a solution to the Ukraine problem, not only for India but more generally. And I hope they come up with something that is sustainable, because it's bad for it's been bad for Russia, it's been bad for Europe, it's been bad for the South, it's been bad for the Ukrainians, obviously. So we need a solution, and if Trump can provide that, then good on him. To be honest, it's a problem, I think, globally, that needs to be put to one side if we're going to come up with a more effective kind of international cooperation system.
One last question, Richard. Again, this time, given the 25% tariff on Indian products and several other developing countries, what do they do? I mean, in the immediate short term, how should they go about?
Look, it's you can't. It's going to have some short-term damage. I mean, I guess they're going to have to. They're going to have to. It's where South comes in again. I mean, it's not that there are alternative markets out there, Ravi.
Right.
I mean, there are alternative markets out there, and it's incumbent on governments to provide their private sector with appropriate support and alliances that can fill the temporary shocks that's going to cause. It's a policy problem.
Right. That's the major challenge haunting in the Indian government and others at this point of time. But should they actually negotiate for better conditions under duress?
Look, I think there's negotiation will be ongoing. I think we go back to the point that we talked about at the beginning. It's very difficult to negotiate with a regime that is so fickle and unpredictable. You can agree to something one day and 2 weeks later they change their mind, and that's which is not to say that they shouldn't negotiate. Of course, that's part of statesmanship, and we need it. But I think we can't be so naive to pretend that something that's agreed one day is going to be persistent over a sustainable period of time. That's not the world we seem to be in anymore, Ravi.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard. Thank you for giving this time for the Federal. and you've addressed several very complicated and complex issues. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ravi. Nice to see you.
Thanks.